Okay, so I'm going to review what I said yesterday briefly, and then I'll move to finish up the topic we were talking about. The 10th principle of Jewish commitment, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows the actions, people's actions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows people's actions. Not like those who say, Ozav Hashem ha'aretz, HaKadosh Baruch Hu abandoned the world. We're of not sufficient importance to be concerned with, certainly not the details of our lives. No, not true. Baruch Hu knows everything that's going on. And he specifies the actions of people. Now, of course, it's hard to believe he knows everything. You know, we're not excluding what goes on with atoms and with clouds and with galaxies. So the question is, why is he specifying the actions of people? And the answer is that even if you allow that God knows everything else, there's a special problem about knowing the actions of people. And the problem is that if he knows what we do, that seems to contradict the fact that we have free will. And the contradiction works like this. And if this is the first time you're watching, then it only works like this. Just as I'm going to say, no variations. When I do a free action, it seems to me I have two alternatives. I choose one, and that's why it happens. I could have chosen the other one. If God knows what we do, and in particular, if he knows what we do before we do it, then it seems like we couldn't do the other one. Because doing the other one would contradict God's knowledge. And that's not possible. That's the problem. I'm choosing between A and B. I choose A. In my mind, I could have done B just as well. That's why we sometimes call it a free choice. I chose between A and B. I made A happen. I could have made B happen. But if God knew yesterday I was going to do A, then it seems like B really isn't possible. Because to do B would be to contradict what God knew yesterday, and you can't contradict God's knowledge. That's the problem. There's a solution to the problem. And the solution is, well, I really did A, and God knew yesterday that I was going to do A. But if you imagine me doing B, then God's knowledge yesterday wouldn't have been that I was going to do A. It would have been that I'm going to do B. If you change what I do, God's knowledge also changes. And then it's perfectly consistent. It's only if you take a look at the real world. In the real world, I did A, and God yesterday knew I was going to do A. And I say, let's consider another possibility, which isn't real, didn't happen, but another possibility where I do B, but you restrict and say, but when I'm considering B, which didn't happen, I'm going to take what did happen with God's knowledge and put that into the new picture. I asked the critic, who told you to do that? Why are you stuck on, you changed what happened. So maybe if you change what happened, then God's knowledge changes also. That's the mistake that the critic makes. Now, identifying that as a mistake is based on a certain general idea, and that is what God knows depends upon what I do. He knows what I do. If I do A, he knows I do A. If I do B, he knows I do B. And I told you I was very happy to see that an idea that I had intuitively a number of years ago, the Maharal wrote 500 years ago, that the verses and the statements in the rabbinic literature that describe God's knowledge of human actions is all perception talk. It's talk of vision, of seeing, of hearing, of perceiving, of observing. It's all perception talk. Perception is precisely a situation where something happens and the perceiver sees what happens, and that's what he knows. He knows what he sees. Had something different happened, he would have known something different. So if that's your picture of how God's knowledge is brought into being, then you have no trouble with this critique of free will, because you say, I did A, and God knew I was going to do A. I could have done B, and had I done B, God would have known I was going to do B. And both of them are perfectly consistent. That's the solution. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, I said the Rambam doesn't buy that solution. And whatever you think about what he wrote in the Mishnah Torah, it's quite confusing and subtle, I think. But in part 3, chapter 17 of the guide, he says explicitly, he's criticizing a certain school of Arabic philosophy, and he says, these people think that God knows everything and that man has free will, and a little thought will reveal to you that that's a contradiction. Period. It's a contradiction, period. So the Rambam is not solving this. He's telling you there's no solution for it because it's a contradiction. So what he says in the Mishnah Torah is, as I said, the words of the Mishnah Torah are subtle, and you have to be careful when you read them. But what I'm taking from the Mishnah Torah is this, that the problem that you're facing is a contradiction between God's knowledge and free will. We're not going to say that God knows. So then there's no contradiction. One of the two things that are supposed to conflict, we don't assert, we don't believe it, we don't express it. You'll say to me, what are you talking about? What are you talking about, Rabbi? God, you're not going to say God knows? You're giving up on the fact that God knows everything that is, everything there is, could be, and everything else? And the answer is yes. We're not going to say that. Oh, Rabbi, are you telling me therefore that God is ignorant? I can't buy that. Sorry. And here's where we say the first surprising thing. No, we're not going to say he knows, and we're not going to say he's ignorant. Well, how do you do that, Rabbi? I mean, if you don't know, then you're ignorant, right? Well, sort of. I mean, if you're the kind of thing that could know, and you lack knowledge, then you're ignorant. But if you're the kind of thing that couldn't know in the first place, then we'll say you don't know and you're not ignorant either, you're just not in the discussion. Like, for example, a stone. A stone doesn't know things, but a stone isn't ignorant either. It's just not a candidate for the whole discussion. And the overarching principle is that God is beyond our ability to describe, understand, conceptualize. And that being the case, we don't say anything about God. That's why we don't have to draw the conclusion that if we don't say he knows, he's ignorant, because saying he knows is human talk, and saying he's ignorant is human talk, and all human talk is disqualified. Yeah.
There's a passage in Tehillim which says, like, well, they say that Dovid is like talking about the people who criticize Hashem, and he says facetiously that as if Hashem doesn't know.
Right, I'm coming to that. That's one more step down the line. Right, that's the problem I ended up with yesterday, which I didn't answer. I'm just getting there, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
So the idea is that according to this part of the Rambam, Hashem, God is completely above language. There's no way to relate with Hashem through language.
That's right. That's right. Language is a human tool, and it's a human tool that's given to him for certain types of human uses, and God is beyond that. Because Baruch Hu says, who can you compare me to? If he was something we could understand, then we could compare it to other things that we understand, but you can't compare Kodesh Baruch Hu to anything. Okay, so now the first thing to say is that, as I said yesterday, based on one thing the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah, we are told that even though God, we're not going to say God knows, God is not handicapped by not knowing. It's not handicapped. Why? Because everything that we could do with knowledge, he can do. He just doesn't do it with knowledge. He does it another way that we can't understand. That's not to say he knows, we don't know how he knows. That would not be strictly correct. Because we can't say he knows. But we can say his capacities for action aren't restricted on the grounds that he doesn't know, because he can do from where he is everything that we can do with knowledge, but he does it without knowledge. He does it some other way that we can't understand. Now the question is, as you just raised, and as we said yesterday, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of descriptions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the literature, the 1,000 pages of Tanakh, the Midrashim, the two Talmuds, the commentaries. What are we going to do with all those descriptions if we can't describe God? And the Rambam in part 1, chapter 54 of the guide says, we're not talking about what he is, we're talking about what he does. That's the crucial distinction. We're not talking about what he is, we're talking about his actions. And just to introduce you to a general theme, which is very important, well, I haven't time to develop it in detail tonight, the Ramchal, the great Kabbalist of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, on the first page of his Klolim Rishonim, which is a work on strict Kabbalah, says exactly the same thing. The Spheros are descriptions of his actions. And that's all we can talk about, his actions. And in fact, the style and the vocabulary of the first page of Klolim Rishonim is a copy of the Rambam in part 154, chapter 54. So, when you see what is linguistically a description of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what you need to do is translate it. What I'm telling you now, I learned from Mahavdil, something called fictionalism in philosophy of science. It's a three-step process. I'm saying this now. This is why I recommend you relate to the idea. You have a pasuk that says HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Q. Step 1, pretend he really is Q. Pretend it's literal and it's true. Step 2, ask yourself, because he's Q, what does he do? What can he do? What would he do? What difference would being Q make to his actions? Step 3, subtract Q and just stick with the description of the actions. That's what it means. So, for example, if you say God is just, step 1, pretend he's just. He really is just. Justice is a principle that he uses. Now, step 2, since he's just, what would he do? Well, he would reward people who have earned reward. He would punish people who have violated his will and committed crimes. And he would do so in a proportional manner and with all the other things that are built into justice. That's what he would do if he were really just. And then subtract justice. This is what happens. What happens is people ultimately get what is proportionate to the actions that they performed. Perform good actions, they get reward. Perform bad actions, they get punishment. They're proportional to what they did. Just leave justice out. Same thing with mercy. God is merciful. Okay, step 1, pretend he really is merciful. He's a merciful being with a merciful heart and a principle of acting on mercy. Step 2, given that he really is merciful, what would he do? How would mercy show in action? Well, sometimes when strict justice requires punishment, mercy says delay the punishment, dilute the punishment, give the person extra means to withstand the punishment and pick himself up afterwards and so forth and so on. That's what a merciful being would do. And then, step 3, subtract mercy. There's no mercy in God. We're not talking about God at all. But when people undergo difficulties, and those difficulties are due to the transgressions that they performed, together with those difficulties, there are other things added to their experience, which enables it to be easier, or its delay doesn't happen right away, or it doesn't happen full force. That's what happens in the world. Those are the things that happen in the world. So in the end of the day, when you go through the 3 steps, you end up without the direct description of Kodesh Baruch Hu. What you end up with is only a description of his actions. That we can describe. And let me just put it in as a footnote. I mean, maybe it's obvious to all of you, but we can describe it because he told us, not because we can figure it out. He told us. The question here is not, how do you know? The question is, are you qualified to understand? and the subject is, if there were talk about what God is, you're not qualified to understand, so it's not on the table. If there's talk about what he does, you're qualified to understand. So if there is a source that delivers to you a description of what he does, that's something you can understand. Okay, so that's the general principle of how you deal with descriptions of God without saying that you're talking about what God is. You're only talking about what God does. Are we together? Okay, now I want to add in one more remark, and then I'm going to go on to the next principle. We talk about action. Action has a very rich structure, so that when we talk about describing God's actions, maybe more is packed into it than you might otherwise suspect. Person trips and falls. We don't call that an action. That's something that happens to him. Why did you do that? It was an accident. I tripped. I didn't see it and I fell. What's the difference between someone who trips and falls, on the one hand, and an actor who acts out tripping and falling, on the other hand? When you look at them, you can't tell the difference. He's a good actor. The difference is that in the case of the actor, he chose to do it. And he used his skill to implement what he chose to do. So, first of all, calling something an action reflects the choice of an agent. It's something that's intended. More than that, let's suppose you see someone move in a certain way, and you ask him, why did you do that? Suppose he says, wrong question. There is no why. Why is not appropriate for what happened. I think if you get that reaction, I think what he's telling you is it wasn't an action. Because it was an action of any kind, an action has a why built into it. There's a reason for which it's done, a purpose for which it's done. Even if, in the limiting case, the purpose of doing A was to do A, that could be. Why are you skipping rope? Because I felt like skipping rope, that's all. I wanted to skip rope, so I skipped rope. But if you're skipping rope and you ask him, why are you doing that? And he says, wrong question, then I think maybe he's been hypnotized, or maybe he's using drugs. He can't help himself. Just a very extended twitch. It's good for exercise. I mean, how could why not be relevant if it was an action? Okay, so that means that when we can describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu's actions, that includes describing his purposes, some of them in a limited way that a human being can understand. That's not the whole story, because all of that is true. But we're not excluded from understanding the purpose in the action, because that's part of what makes it an action. So we're being told that we can understand God. Let me try to put this in a guarded way so I don't step over any lines. We can understand whatever it is that's revealed to us about God's act. We can understand that, which is less than one in infinity of the truth. But it's something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicates to us. Describing his actions includes describing purposes. Not all of them, not to the bottom, but there is a purpose. So, for example, when Moses at the burning bush, and says to Moses, you have to go down and save the Jewish people, and Moses raises objections, one after another, after another. And one of them is, when I go down there, they're going to ask me, what is your name? What should I say? So, the commentaries, including the Rambam, ask, what is Moshe's worry here? He's worried that when he gets there, the Jews are going to ask, you say that the God of our ancestors has appeared to you. What's his name? They're going to ask that? Why would they ask that? What possible benefit could they get out of asking and getting an answer? Either the answer I give them, Moses, we're speaking of Moses. Either the answer Moses gives is an answer as a name they already know. Okay, so he knows it and they know it. What does that prove? He can know it the same way they know it. And if it's an answer they don't know, then they'll say you're lying. Why should we trust you? How could their asking what is his name help verify or validate or give them confidence in Moses' message? So it's a very difficult question, what Moses thought he was doing there. Now, the Rabbi has a whole long description of proving the necessity of God's existence and all the rest. It's one way. The other commentaries, especially ones that are influenced by Kabbalah, explain like this. Names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are principles of action. You heard that 3 minutes ago, right? They're principles of action. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does things for various different principles. We would like to know what principle of action is governing this process of the Exodus that's taking place. For example, here's two very simplistic possibilities. There are many others, and they're more complicated and sophisticated. But either the purpose of the events is to punish the Egyptians for their evil, and that's going to destroy their power, and we will walk free as a consequence of punishing the Egyptians. Or the purpose is mercy for us, because we're suffering. Something done on our, and that's why the Egyptians are being punished. Those are two different principles of action that could govern the whole process. And the nafkamina, the difference in practical terms will be this. Mercy is something you have to earn. Mercy isn't guaranteed. Mercy always means, as I said 20 minutes ago, mercy means modifying justice, not allowing justice to express itself to the end. And if mercy raises its head and says, don't punish like that, justice says, why not? It's just, isn't it? Why shouldn't he be punished like that? And you have to have an answer. Why not? I learned this from Dovid Kronglass. It's one of the Rocha in Baltimore. I didn't know him, but I heard it on a tape that he said. It was a very profound thought. Chesed isn't like that, but mercy is like that. Mercy's always got an uphill battle against justice. So there's an example of where you want to know the principle of action because it makes a big difference to how you behave, what you can expect. So principles of action include purpose, and that's something that we can understand about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so now I've described the Rambam's position, and according to the Rivash, those are the only two positions. Anybody else? The only driving question in this subject is God's knowledge dependent upon our action, or is it not dependent upon our action? That's the driving principle. Oh yes, I left out. I should say, why does the Rambam not follow the Rivash and others? Because he rejects strenuously the idea that anything could have an effect on the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Nothing about the Kodesh Baruch Hu should be caused in him by something outside of himself. In the first part of the guide, in the Hebrew translation, I don't understand the Arabic, but the Hebrew translation is hi pa'alus, which means being acted upon. And if I'm not mistaken, he says 6 times that it's forbidden to assert that of Kodesh Baruch Hu. Sometimes he says because hi pa'alus would imply change. If something acts upon him and brings about some element in him, that means before this acted upon him, he didn't have it. Now he does have it, there'll be change. But sometimes he doesn't mention change. He's rejecting the idea that anything acts upon the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Given that rejection, he's not going to buy the solution that our actions cause the Kodesh Baruch Hu to know. He can't buy that, and therefore he can't follow that solution. And if he doesn't follow that solution, he responds to the problem by denying that we can, let me say this carefully, he uses the principle which he has elaborated elsewhere for other purposes, other foundational ideas, here to say, we're not going to describe a Kodesh Baruch Hu, and we're not going to say he knows, and since we're not going to say he knows, there's no contradiction. That's the bottom line. Okay. Now, that was 10. The 11th, that Hu Yisala, may he be praised, gives reward to those who fulfill the mitzvos of the Torah, and punishes those who violate its prohibitions. And the greatest of the rewards is the world to come. That's a statement we have to think about very carefully. And the worst of the punishments, the strongest of the punishments, is being cut off. And being cut off means losing the world to come. So the greatest of the rewards is being in the world to come, and the greatest of the punishments is to lose the world to come. And we have already discussed this subject. All this is necessary. In the beginning of this whole section, he discussed it in some detail. And the verse that indicates this principle is, it's interesting, there are hundreds of verses. We have to understand why the Rambam chose this. When God says to Moses that after the golden calf, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people and make a new nation out of you, and Moses protests and says, I want you not to destroy them. And Moses says, Im tisoach atasam v'im ayin mechenina misefecha. If you will carry their sin, meaning not to punish them by destroying them, and Moses leaves that part of the sentence unfinished. If you will do what I'm asking you to do, no, everything's fine. And if not, then erase me from the book that you have written. Wipe me out from the book that you have written. So he asks, well, so what's that got to do with getting reward in the world to come? And reward and punishment. And it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer to him. Baruch Hu's answer is, Mi asher chotali and v'chenu mi sifri. I put it playfully that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, don't tell me how to write my book. Don't tell me how to write my book. He who has sinned against me, I will wipe out from my book. So the ones who sin get wiped out, and the ones who don't sin don't get wiped out. That's the verse that indicates, that he brings to indicate this. There's a proof, he says, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows who fulfills his will and who violates it, which really follows from the previous one. And I told you the one, they're not all logically completely independent. That is a proof here that he knows, because he says, someone who violates my will is going to be wiped out, and somebody who fulfills my will is not going to be wiped out. So obviously he knows which is which. And he gives the reward to one and punishment to the other. Okay, now I'm just now finished the book on subject of Shkocha Pratis, especially in the Rambam. So there's an enormous amount to say here. It would take us 3 or 4 days at least to summarize it. I'm not going to do that now. But when he says that the greatest of the goods is the world to come, we have to understand that it's not just that there are lots of goods, and there are bigger goods and smaller goods, and this is bigger than all the other ones. It's much, much more drastic than that. And if you look in the 9th chapter of Hilchos Tshuva, Laws of Tshuva, where he discusses this at great length, what you will see is this. And also in the 2 chapters of the guide where he talks about the book of Job, where he talks about this at great length, and other chapters. There is only one intrinsic good. There's only one thing that's good in and of itself. There's only one goal. There's only one thing to ultimately get to. Everything else has good only as a means to that goal. And the goal, this may be shattering to some of you because you have wrong ideas about the Rambam. The goal is dveikus. Being attached to HaKadosh Baruch Hu consciously, and because of that attachment, serving him and performing his will. That's the goal. And if you think the Rambam is a philosopher, and he believes in Aristotle, chas v'sholem, and he thinks that thinking is everything and knowing is everything, dead wrong. He says, knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads you to love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Knowledge and love are not the avodah. They're not the avodah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're just preconditions. And knowledge and love lead you to focus your mind on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the focusing of your mind on HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads you to fulfilling His will. So the avodah is focusing your mind experientially, and then, as a consequence, fulfilling His will. The Rambam writes, I'll just give you one more example. The Rambam writes, the person who really achieved appropriate worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, can you imagine? It's the most precious time of the day, but a very, very precious time of the day is when he's on his couch going to sleep. That's a very precious time of the day. Why is that? Why isn't it when he's putting on tefillin? Why isn't it when he's benching after a meal, doing mitzvahs deraisa? No, those last minutes before he falls, because he can concentrate and meditate on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and nothing will bother him. During the rest of it, what am I going to do in the next hour? How will I answer that telephone call? And so-and-so needs money. Where am I going to get the money from? But when he's going to sleep, he's completely cleared his mind of everything else, and he can just focus on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay? That's the only intrinsic good. Everything else in life, life itself, health, simcha, teaching Torah and learning Torah and whatever it is, all of them are means to dveikus. Dveikus is it. Of course, once you're dovek, you do His will. If His will is that you should teach Torah and so on and so on, if you do it out of dveikus, then it's part of the expression of the dveikus. The very last chapter of the guide, which ends with the talking about the greatness of knowing Kadosh Baruch Hu from the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, he finishes talking about the pasuk and says, but the pasuk goes on. Haskel yado osi? No, it doesn't end there. It says, lasos tzaka v'chesed b'mishpat ba'aretz ki be'ela chavatzi nu Hashem. So let's talk about it. A person who knows me will be doing these things in the world because these are the things that I want done in the world, and he's living there as an expression of what I want in the world. So this knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to express itself in action also. That's the true worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when he says here that it's the biggest, now by the way, I don't know the Arabic here, so maybe the Arabic has in it some of what I'm saying. I'm reading a Hebrew translation. So it's not just that it's bigger than the other ones. It is the goal of all activity. And this has gigantic consequences. In the 8th and 9th chapter of the laws of Tshuva, the Rambam talks about taiva, ta'ava. Some of you have heard that word in certain types of shmuzim, certain types of yeshivas. Now let me ask you something. Is taiva bad by definition? Well, let me remind you that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is described as having taiva. Right? Iva dira b'taktonim. Baruch Hu desired to dwell among the lower worlds. Po eshev ki visiha. I'm going to take up a residence here because I've desired it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu misavel l'tfilos shel tzadikim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires the tefillah, the prayers of the tzadikim. So it can't be all bad. Can't be all bad. Not if it's described of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says that all Jews, the best of the Jews, Neviyehem v'chachmehem, the prophets and the sages, all had a taiva for Yemos HaMashiach, because in Yemos HaMashiach we'll be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, both by doing mitzvos, as it says in chapter 9, over and over again, and learning Torah and learning about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and thereby be Zocher to Olam Haba. So it's appropriate to have a taiva for Olam Haba. That's the root taiva, because taiva is appropriate when it's directed to something that really has value. Taiva is an appropriate attitude towards something that really has value. That's what's so tragic about people who have taivas for things that don't really have value. Taiva for Olam Haba is dveikus. That's what it is. It's dveikus in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And since Yemos Mashiach is the means to getting to Olam Haba, so then it's valuable as a means to dveikus. That's a real value. It's just a value of a means, not a value of the end. So the idea of Gottleib here means more fundamental, more absolute, because it is the ultimate goal that needs to be worked for. And the other thing, I'm just going to mention this, I have a long section of this in the book. The other thing is that when you realize that the only thing of intrinsic value is dveikus, then when you see people's fortunes in life, and when you see that they acquire or lose other things, when you talk about Hashem's justice in running the world, you have to remember that everything else in the world besides dveikus has value only as a means. So if you see that someone had a house and then lost the house, that alone gives you absolutely no question about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's justice. So what? A house is nothing. Or health, or happiness, or whatever you like. Comfort versus pain. None of them have any value at all except as a means to dveikus. If you saw that a tzaddik was deprived of dveikus, then you would have a claim. Of course, it can be deprived of dveikus momentarily in order to provide him with much greater dveikus later. That could be. But if there was a net loss in dveikus, that would be a problem, because dveikus is the real value. And there, Kodesh Baruch Hu's justice would have to show. Kodesh Baruch Hu's justice doesn't have to show in anything else in life, so a lot of the tzaddik v'ralo goes away. Why is it ralo? Who says it's ralo? You show me that it deprived him of dveikus. Then you might have a claim. But just because he lost it? Who says tzaddikim should be rich? Who says tzaddikim should be healthy? Who said? No such havamina. Okay, a lot of work has to be done to get to that conclusion, as I do in the book. But that's what's going on here behind the scenes when he says that the great reward is the world to come. Yes, ma'am.
And it seems like it's like the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim. How? Because first we have to be taken out from a lot of things that we are in, and then we get in the midbar, which is like and it's sort of an expression of the Veikus. It's like we were just like completely in surrounded by all the conditions that we could be entirely connected. But the goal of that was to get to Israel. So. Okay,
so. I'll repeat it for that because they tell me sometimes. The question was, in Mitzrayim, things were terrible. And then we left Mitzrayim. We ended up in the Midbar, in the wilderness. There we were surrounded by all the conditions that make dveikus on the table. But the goal of that was to get to Eretz Israel, where all those conditions disappear, and you're living in the natural world, where dveikus certainly isn't as easy, it won't be as complete, and so forth and so on. And if dveikus is really the highest goal, why then wouldn't it be that living in the wilderness with the clouds of glory and all the rest would be the ideal condition for a Jew? It's a good question. The answer to that question is in detail in chapter 2 of the Way of God by Luzzatto. Dveikus can't be a gift. It can't be given. Dveikus has to be earned. The very idea of being dovek in HaKadosh Baruch Hu because he hands it to you is a contradiction in terms. After all, The neshama, the soul, before it comes into this world, is in a condition of direct connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's only coming into this world with a physical barrier, which then cuts it off from its direct relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why does it come into this world? Why not just leave it in that world? And it's like saying, why doesn't the Kodesh Baruch Hu create the world to come? Just create it right away. Why must we go through this detour? And there's a lot of literature on that. But the bottom line is that the Dveikus is a kind of relationship. And it's a relationship which requires some kind of equality between us and the Kodesh Baruch Hu. A squirrel cannot have Dveikus with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, nor can a malach have Dveikus with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. There's a midrash in Shir Hashirim, a shocking midrash. The Shir Hashirim says, Zos Tamasi, this is my pure one, this is Kodesh Baruch Hu speaking to Klal Yisrael. And the midrash says, Atik b'ta'amasi el to'omasi, this is my twin. Kodesh Baruch Hu is calling Klal Yisrael his twin. That's challenging. He's the infinite creator of the world, and we are people. Thank you. So how do we? So as it's true in all of Chazal, general statements are a haka b'ma'askinan. They're talking about some particular dimension always, what's called relative equality in logic rather than absolute equality, equality in a respect. And he goes on to say, I'm not bigger than she is, and she's not bigger than I am. There's a certain respect in which we are equal. Ramchal explains the equality as the perfection of the Bria. The Bria was created with certain kochos which are unrealized, and has to go through a process of realization to become perfected. And that perfection of the creation is something which we are going to do together with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Shutafim b'ma'aseh bereishis. We are his partners. Of course, we aren't equal partners. No, he does 99.99, and we do 0.01. Well, 0.01. But we're both necessary. We're both necessary. And that's what sets up a relationship between us, which can be called Dveikus. Take a look in the second chapter of the Derech Hashem. He writes there about it in detail, why it's required and what it does. So what happened in the Midbar, first of all, the time in the Midbar should have been much shorter, right? It should have gone right in after the creating of the Mishkan. Shouldn't have been after 40 years. That was because of a mistake that they made. It should have been much shorter. But even afterwards, it wasn't earned there. It was given to them without earning it, and therefore it wasn't really Dveikus. It was meditating on. It was but it's much more involved than just that. Yes.
We're not in equal part because we're not both needed in the same sense, because Hashem could just not have this world. Once this world is created, we have a 1% role to play, but in reality we're not really a necessary factor.
I'm not sure that's right. It's sort of like saying, if I paint a picture and I cut it up into pieces, irregularly shaped pieces, and I send it to you in a box, does it need to be put together? Well, it does if it's going to be a picture, because right now it's just irregularly shaped pieces of a picture. To make it into a picture, you've got to put it together. Now you say, but I didn't have to cut it up. I could have sent it whole. I could have done that. But I didn't. I cut it up into pieces. Once I cut it up into pieces, it now needs to be put together. So Kodesh Baruch Hu could have not created this world, and not created this type of universe, and not created with all these rules. Yes, he could have done otherwise, even though that's a tricky statement. It's a tricky statement. I'm just pointing that out, but leaving that aside. He could have done it otherwise. But once having decided to create this now needs to be completed because of the way that it's created. So it's not incorrect to say that it needs it. All you're pointing out, as far as I can understand, is that it didn't have to need it. It didn't have to exist at all. Something else could have been here which wouldn't have required our participation. Let's say that's true. But that doesn't take away from the fact that having created this, it really needs our participation.
But
Yeah.
at the end, when you're looking at the picture from our perspective, it's not so much not so much a necessary. No, we're a necessary factor once Hashem chooses to create it as it is.
Yeah.
In essence, we can't call ourselves a necessary factor.
I don't see why not. If the goal is to have a picture, and all we are presented with is pieces, and he's not doing more than that, then it's up to us to make the picture. And by the way, when you'll have children, you'll understand this very well. You get them puzzles because it develops them. It's good for them to make pictures out of pieces. They need pieces, not pictures. They need pieces, davka, because that way they develop. So the fact that it's in pieces, this is a point which I only came to formulate clearly very recently. To say that something's perfect can either mean that it is shalem, all of its aspects are complete, or it can mean it's perfect for its purpose. And if you're trying to do something developmental for your child, giving him whole pictures isn't perfect. They're perfect pictures, but they're not perfect for him. He needs developmental development. He needs development, and the development has to come through taking pieces and making pictures out of them. So the ones that's pieces is perfect for him. This world is perfect. It's the perfect tool for achieving the goal that Kodesh Baruch Hu wants. And one aspect of its perfection is that it's incomplete. One aspect of its perfection is that it has potentialities that aren't realized. That's why it's perfect for its purpose. I think that's very important to keep in mind, the difference between perfect full stop versus perfect for its purpose. That gives you a much broader framework to think about things than simply, is it missing a piece or isn't it missing a piece? Okay.